Anyone who's ever pooped on Mars knows that every time you go, the waste gets dehydrated, vacuum sealed, and pressed into something like a cracker. As for the processed waste, Mark opened a box of it directly, rehydrated the poop to soften it back up, releasing its original stench. Then he scooped some up with a spoon, placed it in the red Martian soil, dropped half a potato on top, and covered it with dirt. Just like that, the first person to grow potatoes on Mars had arrived. Now Mark had to become a farmer on Mars, growing enough potatoes to feed himself for 3 years, if he wanted to survive. And it all started a few days earlier, with a massive dust storm. Mark and his 5 crewmates were on the Martian surface conducting collection missions, when disaster struck without warning. The storm was so violent it could tip over a rocket on launch. Faced with a life or death decision, Commander Lewis gave the order for an emergency evacuation. The sky was choked with red sand, visibility dropping to nearly zero. The crew struggled through the howling wind toward the ascent vehicle. Then tragedy struck. Mark was struck by a piece of antenna debris and flung away. Telemetry showed his suit was severely breached. He had less than a minute to live. Lewis was determined to go back for Mark, but the vehicle was tilting dangerously. If it tipped over, the entire crew would be lost. With no other choice, Lewis gave the order to launch, her heartbreaking. As the rocket lifted off, Mark was left behind on Mars. NASA soon announced Mark's death to the public, but Mark, who should have been dead, miraculously survived. The antenna fragment had pierced his abdomen, but the bleeding quickly clotted in the extreme cold, forming a seal that stopped the air from leaking out of his suit. By sheer luck, Mark had cheated death. Gritting through the pain, he made his way back to the habitat. Without anesthesia, he clenched his jaw, pulled the antenna out of his stomach with his bare hands, and stitched up the wound in front of a mirror. When it was all over, Mark looked around the empty base and finally realized the horrifying truth. The communications antenna was destroyed. On Mars, 55 million kilometers from Earth, no one knew he was alive. Survival instinct kicked in, and Mark began taking stock of his supplies. The habitat was stocked with provisions for a 6-person, 30-day mission. If he rationed carefully, the food in the habitat could just barely sustain him for about a year. But the next manned mission to Mars wouldn't arrive for another 4 years. That left a 3-year food gap, his biggest problem. Then, in a stroke of luck, he found a bag of raw potatoes left behind by his crewmates. As a brilliant botanist, Mark came up with an audacious plan: grow potatoes on Mars.
Mars will come to fear my botany powers.
But growing potatoes on Mars was far from simple. Martian soil is barren, with no organic matter, and lacks the water and temperature needed for plants to grow. To solve these problems, Mark converted a workroom into a sealed greenhouse, hauled in tons of Martian soil from outside, covering over 120 square meters, and collected his crewmate's feces to fertilize it. Then he planted the potatoes. But a new, fatal problem emerged. There wasn't enough water for the potatoes to grow. Calculations showed that a 120 square meter potato field would require enormous amounts of water. So Mark once again put his chemistry skills to use, turning his attention to the leftover fuel in the landing vehicle, hydrazine. With iridium as a catalyst, hydrazine could be split into nitrogen and hydrogen. To keep his breathing from affecting the oxygen levels, Mark put on his helmet. Then he ignited the hydrogen to produce water. The flame flickered steadily. Through the night, condensed water dripped like rain throughout the greenhouse. The water problem was solved. After more than 2 weeks of hard work, a miracle finally appeared. In that dead red soil, a tiny green shoot pushed through. It was the first plant ever grown on Mars, and a glimmer of hope for Mark's survival. As he waited for the potatoes to bear fruit, Mark repaired the solar panels that had been knocked over by the storm. While he was racking his brain for a way to be rescued, 55 million kilometers away on Earth, a grand funeral was being held for him. The world mourned the loss of this brave astronaut. But then, a female communications officer, while performing routine photo comparisons at the Mars Satellite Monitoring Center, noticed something alarming. The Mars rover at the Ares 3 base had moved, and the toppled solar panels had been neatly rearranged. She quickly reported her findings to her superiors. The director of NASA's scalp went numb. A living person, left behind on Mars. That was a disaster no one could take the fall for. But the truth couldn't be hidden forever. The news that Mark was alive got out. The director was forced to go public. His evasive remarks couldn't shake the press, so Kapoor stepped in.
But if we could talk to him, we would tell him to stay put and to trust that we are doing everything in our power to bring him home alive.
That promise landed like a hammer, restoring the agency's credibility, but giving the director a massive headache. Rescue required a rocket, and the rocket would take 6 months to build. By then, Mark would have starved to death. The director gave the engineers just 3 months, and while NASA fretted over Mark starving, he had already achieved potato independence, the happiest farmer on Mars. With the food problem solved, establishing contact with Earth became the top priority. Mark wanted to find the Pathfinder, hundreds of kilometers away. A NASA rover launched in 1996. Its antenna and photo transmission systems might still be intact. To make the journey, Mark modified the Mars rover. However, nighttime temperatures on Mars dropped to dozens of degrees below zero. Without a heater, he'd freeze to death. But running the heater would drain the rover's battery before he reached his destination. Faced with this dilemma, Mark made a crazy decision. He dug up a radioisotope thermoelectric generator from outside the base, something astronauts usually avoided at all costs, because a radiation leak would destroy the human body in days. But Mark didn't care. He strapped that big space heater into the rover. With this wild determination, after 15 days of bumpy travel, Mark finally unearthed the Pathfinder, buried under sand and dust for nearly 20 years. He packed it up and headed back to base. Meanwhile, at the NASA lab, Kapoor spotted Mark's movement. Based on his direction, Kapoor quickly deduced that Mark was going for the Pathfinder, and immediately arranged for signal matching work. Back at the base, Mark connected the power supply to the battery. Suddenly, the dormant Pathfinder replica in the lab flashed a signal light, but since Pathfinder couldn't type or transmit complex voice, Mark placed boards with letters and numbers around its camera, using hexadecimal code. By pointing the camera at a certain code, a simple lookup table would spell out full English words. Through this method, Mark bridged communication with Earth. Then, guided by lab technicians, Mark modified the rover's software system and successfully linked with the Pathfinder, allowing real-time text communication.
Glad to hear it. Really looking forward to not dying.
When the news that Mark was alive reached the spacecraft, the returning crew was thunderstruck, followed by overwhelming guilt. Lewis regretted not going back for him, but Mark didn't blame her one bit. He was busy being the world's most watched internet sensation. Every move he made was streamed live to Earth. Far from a desperate castaway, he proudly showed off his potato empire.
So, technically, I colonized Mars.
Just as the world celebrated Mark's miracle, Mars showed its fickle side once again. Due to prolonged pressure shifts and sand erosion, as Mark passed through the airlock, it suffered a violent depressurization and explosion. The blast cracked his helmet, and oxygen was leaking fast. Luckily, Mark sealed the crack with duct tape in time, saving his life for now. But when he got back to the base, the sight sent him into despair. The explosion had exposed the greenhouse to Mars's extreme cold and low pressure. All the potato seedlings were dead. The microbes in the soil had also perished in the freezing dryness. That meant Mark could no longer grow unlimited food. The next day, Mark patched the airlock with plastic sheeting, barely restoring the base's function. But he knew that plastic sheet was the only barrier between him and death. After recounting his supplies, his rations would last only about 600 days. NASA's planned resupply would arrive in 800 days at best. Those extra 200 days were an unbridgeable gap. The pressure shifted to NASA headquarters. To get supplies to Mark before he starved, the director ordered a supply rocket built in 45 days. But haste makes waste. With the timeline compressed to the extreme, the engineering team cut many safety tests. On launch day, the world watched. But because the cargo hadn't undergone strict shock testing, it shifted during launch, throwing the rocket's center of gravity off balance. Under the world's gaze, it exploded into a spectacular but tragic firework. The first rescue attempt ended in bitter failure. When the news reached Mars, Mark's mental defenses were shattered like never before. Just as both sides fell into despair, help came from across the ocean. Two senior officials at the China National Space Administration saw the tragedy. They had a ready-to-launch Taiyangtian rocket. In the spirit of humanity, the Chinese Space Agency abandoned their original mission and provided NASA with the Taiyangtian booster to deliver rescue supplies. Hope was renewed. At NASA, a brilliant astrodynamicist offered a better plan. Keep the returning spacecraft at speed. Use Earth's gravity slingshot to loop around. Receive supplies and fuel from the Chinese rocket en route. Then accelerate at full throttle, reaching Mars orbit 500 days later. The most brilliant part? The spacecraft wouldn't need to slow down. Mark would launch from Mars and rendezvous with it at high speed. After all met up, they'd return to Earth together. But the director thought it was too risky. He wouldn't gamble with all the astronauts' lives and stuck stubbornly to the original plan. Launch the Taiyangtian for supply delivery. The director had the final say, and no one else could override him.
You goddamn coward.
On Mars, Mark had already recorded his final message, but he didn't wait around to die. Instead, he felt strangely relieved and continued the experiments his crewmates had left unfinished. Meanwhile, on the spacecraft, an anonymous email arrived, a complete plan to change course and rescue Mark. The only one who could stand up to the director now was Lewis, who controlled the spacecraft. After a vote, the entire crew unanimously decided to abandon their trip home, disobey orders, and return to Mars to rescue Mark. They rebooted the system, cut off NASA's control, altered the course, act first and ask for permission later, and the sender of the email was Rich, the director of the space station. He paid the price of his resignation to secure the director's final approval for the rescue. Soon after, the Taiyangtian rocket blasted off, a perfect launch. The spacecraft successfully received the life-saving supplies. With everything ready, the spacecraft turned around and set full speed for Mars. Over 200 days passed. To save every bite of food, Mark had become gaunt and skeletal. With 100 days until the spacecraft arrived, Mark decided to leave early. For the pre-planned launch site, he used every last ounce of energy to modify and expand the rover, loading it with all the solar panels, air circulation systems, and remaining rations. On Martian Day 461, Mark took one last look at the base he'd called home for so long, then climbed into the rover and drove into the barren wasteland without looking back. The journey was long and unfamiliar. He could only drive for 4 hours a day, about 70 kilometers, then stop for 13 hours to recharge the batteries. Day after day. On the 77th day, Mark finally reached his destination. Before him stood the ascent vehicle left by the previous Mars crew, his only lifeboat, but it was too heavy. To reach the rendezvous altitude, Mark stripped out everything he could, even the roof. Since since Mars's atmosphere is thin, friction during launch would produce no air resistance. A canvas tarp over the top would suffice. NASA calculated that weight reduction was the only way. Even 1 kilogram could mean life or death. On day 560, the spacecraft reached Mars's outer orbit as planned. They couldn't get any closer, or they'd be captured by Mars's gravity and crash. 12 minutes to launch. Mark calmly ate his last meal on Mars. Still bland, still pitifully small, but he ate it with care. Then he shaved off his beard, put on a clean spacesuit, and walked toward the convertible ascent vehicle. When he connected to his crewmate's channel, Mark's voice cracked. Over 500 days of loneliness and fear came flooding out, tears streaming uncontrollably down his face. He had waited nearly 3 years for this moment.
Pilot.
Go!
Pilot, go!
Copy, we'll go.
The engines ignited. Fire cut through Mars's thin atmosphere. Mark had finally left the red planet that had trapped him for over 500 days. The vehicle roared upward, faster and faster. But when the fuel ran out, the altimeter stopped 68 kilometers short of the target. Mark couldn't reach the spacecraft. Lewis immediately decided to move closer to Mark, but they were moving too fast to slow down. If they missed him, Mark would drift forever into deep space. At the critical moment, Lewis suggested detonating a bomb. The target was to blow up the airlock. The bomb went off successfully, venting the cabin's air instantly, creating thrust that slowed the spacecraft. Lewis grabbed a tether and, without hesitation, floated out into space. Mark's figure appeared in view, but the actual situation deviated from expectations. The tether was far too short. There was still 300 meters between them. Without a second thought, Mark punctured the palm of his glove, using the leaking oxygen as propulsion, like Iron Man, and flew toward Lewis across the void.
I got him!
Houston, this is Hermes Actual. We got him. Lobby is secure.
Contact in outer space with Mark.
People everywhere embraced and wept, celebrating a victory for all of humanity. In that moment, there were no borders, no prejudice, only the highest respect for life.